In this section of the course, I'm going to continue to use this handout, which I introduced earlier in the course. We're going to focus now not on underpainting, which is the first column, but on the block-in. Once again, we're trying to identify in this stage what it is we are trying to see and how to see those things in our reference, and then how what we see can be represented using the elements of shape, color, edges, and brushwork. Here in the blocking stage, we squint again, but this time we're trying to see the relative color value in the shapes that we've already identified. By relative color, I mean the value in relationship to the other values in the scene. So is this one darker, lighter? So the relative value is what we're looking for. And as before, we also need to open our eyes so that we can see the true color, the true hue, intensity and value of the colors that we're trying to replicate. Now listen to the description I provide in class on how to add mass of color to these shapes that we've outlined. I have the shapes outlined already, but here I want to draw the mass of each shape by adding consistent color between the lines. That's basically what I'm doing, is I'm bringing now color into my drawing where I didn't have it before. What I have to make sure I do is I need to maintain the accuracy of the shapes that I've drawn, assuming I drew them right? So I need to make sure they're right. In fact, if I wasn't painting a landscape, if I was painting a still life or a portrait, I probably would have been spending a lot more time on the underdrawing, because you need to get those shapes perfect on a portrait. Otherwise, the person's not going to look like a person, and certainly not going to look like themselves. So luckily, with the landscape, you can do the underdrawing pretty quickly, because exactly where things go is not going to make or break the picture. So just maintain the placement of those shapes. I can't change the placement of the shapes if I got them right in the beginning. Color is the primary focus of the block-in stage. We are introducing color at this point, which we didn't really have during the underdrawing. So the first bullet talks about finding the average color and incorporating that into each of the shapes. Within this shape, I'm going to put the same color in the whole shape in the block-in. I'm not going to try to make parts of it lighter, parts of it darker. I can do that later. I'm just trying to get the right color and the right value placed throughout. The next point with regard to color is that of value. Value is the most important element of color as we focus on the block-in. More important than hue or intensity. And we want to limit the number of values to a minimum, maybe 4 to 6. We also want to exaggerate the colors that we see. This is especially true if you're using a photograph for a reference, since so many of the colors are lost, especially in the shadows. And lastly, don't overmix the paint. In the block-in stage, you don't need to mix your colors until they're perfectly blended. In fact, if you do that, you'll actually make a worse painting. If you just mix until you see the color you want, even though it may have streaks, it's perfect. At that stage, you can put it on. Only one point with regard to edges. At this stage, I try to keep all my edges soft. And you guys will see in a minute that hard edges are the kinds of edges that come right off the brush. Okay? You paint, and you've painted hard edges, probably. And you don't want very many hard edges in your painting if you're trying to paint realistically. So at this stage, keep all your edges soft. Once again, keep the paint thin to make the painting that we do later easier. Now let's see how I apply these principles as I actually do the block-in on the painting. I'm going to squint again up here because I'm looking for the relative values. Now, the reason the relative values are important is because, and this is true for all palettes, but with a limited palette, this is as bright a color as I can create. And if I can't make a brighter color than that. And I can't make a darker color than that. I just don't have any other option. Whereas when I look at a photograph, or even worse, if you look in nature, there's a huge variation in value and color that you just can't do with these pigments. So I'm kind of look first, relatively, where's my darkest dark, right?
because my darkest dark can't be darker than that. And where's my lightest light? Well, my lightest light can't be lighter than that. So I have to kind of, you know, with these colors I mix in the very beginning, make sure they fit, right? So for me, the darkest dark, even though I classify all these values in my 4 to 6 value range, I can call them all dark. But my darkest dark is here, and my lightest light is the sky. It's basically all one value to me, and some of the highlights may be the same value. So that's my darkest dark and my lightest light. So for those who are interested in painting high-key, low-key paintings, here's where you make your choice. If you want a low-key painting, then, I mean, we don't have very many highlight or light colors, so it could be low-key. But if you want a high-key, just be careful not to make your darkest dark too dark, because relatively, you know, what is it, half of your painting is that same dark value. So if you want a high-key painting, then you're going to have to tone that up relative to the other colors. I'm going to mix my first color, and I'm going to start with the darkest dark. So relatively, you know, it's not a black. Okay, so I have in my mind the relative value. Now I'm opening my eyes to see the true hue, the true intensity, and value. In that order, just the way we talked about it when we talked about color mixing. So how would you classify this value, this color? What's the basic color? What would you guys call it? Green. You got to call it. You got to pick it, or you don't even know where to start, right? So it's a green. I only have one blue, so that makes my first choice really easy. I'm going to use the blue to start with. And then my next question is, which of the yellows do I want to use? Probably doesn't matter, but if you go back to the color chart, okay, this is a low intensity, right? It's not a bright green. It's a very dull, dark green. So when I'm looking what I'm going to mix it with in the blue, if I look on the other side, I'm probably going to go with the warmer yellow, right? Because it's the furthest away. And I'll probably add some of the burnt umber because it's complement. Exactly. So mix in the yellow first, because my focus first is on the hue, right? I got to get green before I can make it intense or less intense. So I think that's green. It's a little dark, hard to see. Okay, so I've got my hue that I'm going to go with. Now I'm looking at it to make a judgment on intensity. Is that green more or less intense? I don't know. Could be actually pretty close. It just actually, in my view, is still a little bit, the value is too dark. So now I've got my 3 lights. How do I want to lighten it up? If I add white, white is going to cool it down, which may be okay depending on the intensity I'm trying to achieve. If I add either of the yellows, it'll keep it more intense, a green, but I may have to dumb it down with the white anyway. So I'm going to add some more yellow.
With this image, I'm trying to illustrate what you may see when you squint and what you should be looking for when you're trying to identify the average value of each shape. Hopefully you can kind of see what I'm getting at. And then as I switch now to this next illustration, this is what you're trying to make your canvas look like when you paint that average color value onto your canvas. It looks simple, but you've captured the essence of what you need from the block-in stage.
So now I'm going to block it in, and I'm going to keep the edges soft, and I'm not going to change the placement of my shapes, right? Because if I do, I'm at risk of messing up my drawing. I'm going to try to keep the paint thin, like I talked about at this stage, so I'm adding just a little bit of medium so that I don't end up with any texture, brush stroke kind of stuff. Yeah, also it helped my paint last longer since I didn't mix quite enough. You can keep your You can keep your edges soft by staying away from them. You'll probably see a lot of artists do that, where they, at this stage, they just kind of back off from the edges. Or they'll paint, another way to think of it, I guess, is they paint their edges pretty sloppily. And it's not that they're not being careful. In fact, I assume they're being careful about the shape, because they, you know, you want to keep the shape right. But I think what they're trying to do is just have a soft edge. So you can see I'm not investing too much effort in keeping these the color of the shape, the color inside the shape consistent throughout. In fact, it actually helps to have a little bit of variation later on. It just makes some of it easier. So there's that one. And am I going to use the same paint for this other shape? I'm going to try and keep the value the same, because I think the value is, for the overall picture, the value should be the same. But if I open my eyes, I see that this color is more intense, a green, right? It's a little brighter in intensity. So I'm going to stick with my original color. I'm going to try to brighten it up a bit. So I made it more intense by adding the yellow, but I've also changed the value. So if I put that up, it'll read like a different value. So I have to darken it. And so I look at my dark colors. I've got the blue or the red, which will, I can add the red, right, because that's a complement, and it will just reduce the intensity. So I've got a different color. I mean, when you consider the hue and intensity, but I think I've preserved the value, which is the most important thing at this stage, right? Get the value right, the relative value correct. So I'm going to go with that color here.
I'm going to start speeding up some of these sections so you don't have to watch me paint so slowly or listen to me share things that aren't that relevant.
Now, the last dark that I have when I'm looking at big shapes is here. I've got this shape and this shape that are still in that green hue, and the value I think is still pretty close, but if I look at the color, the hue and intensity, it's brighter still, right?
Here I just continue filling in the shapes that are more or less the same color and value.
Now I'm going to switch to a different color. I haven't done all my darks, but I've done all my darks that are green, right? So now I'm going to move to my next dark, which are the shapes on the tree trunks. I call that a shape. And I need to keep that shape relatively the same value, or it will not read as a shape. And so I'm either going to have to make this trunk darker in value than I see it, or this trunk lighter in value than I see it, to maintain an average value. And from a compositional point of view, you know, you can make your choice. For me, I think the composition actually improves if this trunk is easier to separate from the others. I mean, because it kind of blends into this tree, right? You kind of look at it and say, what is that? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a trunk. So I think it would improve the picture if you could see it as a little lighter value. So I'm going with the lighter value that I see on this side, and I'm going to use it throughout. I'm just going to go and soften some of the edges.